Do, 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 do. Hey everybody, looks like we're live. Come on in, grab your beverage. It's time for Coffee with Scott Adams. If you have your coffee, this goes much better. Everybody, simultaneous sip. Well, we've got a number of things to talk about today. One of them is I'm looking at the types of attacks that the anti-Trumpers are making now compared to a year ago. So a year ago, he was incompetent and he was Hitler. Today, the complaints I've heard about the president, and I'm not making this up, these are the actual complaints I've heard about the president. Number one, he golfs more than he said he would. I'm actually reading that complaint today. He uses his own properties for his holiday events. True. And then, of course, they've got the he's mentally incompetent problem. But the trouble is, if your best attack on the president is he's mentally incompetent, the trouble is he keeps going on television and saying things that sound completely logical, capable, same as he's always sounded. So every time you see him, you're waiting for him to do the crazy thing or to reveal his mental health issues, and it doesn't really happen. He just acts the same way he's acted ever since we've been watching him. So their attack on that level is going to fizzle out through lack of confirmation, I think. But I wanted to talk about the approval polls because probably more than any other fallback, you see the anti-Trumpers say, well, if he's doing so well, why are his approval ratings so low? And I would like to suggest, we'll talk about Oprah in a minute, I would like to suggest that approval polls for presidents just don't mean what they used to mean. So in the old days, and I've used this example before, when Gore was running against Bush Jr., I had a preference for Gore, but when Bush won, I said to myself, I'll give him a chance. I'll be open-minded. He had a business background, didn't seem too crazy at the time. I thought to myself, give him a chance, see how he does. Now, it turned out he didn't do very well. But my point is that there wasn't that much difference in my mind between Gore and Bush Jr. Yes, they had very different policies, but in my mind, it wasn't that big of a difference. So when one of them won, it wasn't hard for me to imagine that I could warm up to the other one. All right? It just didn't seem out of the question. But now imagine the divided nation when Clinton and Trump ran against each other. That divide was so great that when one of them won, and it didn't matter which one of them won, the other side was going to say, I am never going to warm up to that one. I am not open-minded. So this is probably the first time that that we've seen an election with such a big divide, and people don't really cross that size of a divide mentally. So we now have a disconnection, and it's a permanent one, I think, between what a president will do and how successful they might be and their approval rating. I think it was reasonable to say that in the past, those two things were tightly coupled. If a president did well, the country said, well, even though that's not the one I voted for, the economy's doing well, we're doing well militarily. If things are doing well, people will say, well, okay, I'll give my approval to this president, even though it's not my first choice. But you'll never see that now. And I would argue that the president's approval rating is probably very similar to what Hillary's would have been because the other side wouldn't warm up to her in the same way that the anti-Trumpers will never warm up to him. So if that's all you have left as your attack on the president, is that the approval polls seem permanently low, I would suggest that's a failure of analysis. That's not really about the candidates. It's about the gap between the candidates. There was such a big gap that you're never going to see that closed. You might get a few percentage by the end of the term. Let's talk about Oprah. There's much excitement on the Democrat side that Oprah is being at least talked about for president. And she did a Golden Globe speech, which people are saying is downright presidential in her tone, etc. And so the question is, people have been asking me, is Oprah a master persuader? Does she have the stuff to become president? Here's the problem. Trump got elected by being the biggest badass running for president because he framed our world as one in which having a badass for a president was an important asset. You know, who's going to fight ISIS? Who's going to stand up to China? Who's going to fight Kim Jong-un? Who's going to stand up to the special interest and all that stuff? Now, Oprah is probably one of the most beloved people in the country. She crosses gender, she crosses race. You know, she appeals to basically everybody. But what did Oprah have to do in order to become Oprah? Like, what was it she's been doing all of her life to be this beloved? It's very simple. She was opposite of Trump. So where he was combative, she was, more loving and inclusive and, whatever is the opposite of being a badass. Here's the problem. You can love her a lot and still say to yourself, but as president, I need somebody who's a badass sometimes. I need somebody who will screw people, because you have to screw some to make things better for most. It's hard to find an exception to that. Oprah has had a career full of one advantage. She never had to screw anybody because she only talked about positive, simple things. If she ever had to change her frame and start talking about how she was going to crush terrorism or negotiate, tough trade agreements, she's going to be so far out of character that she's just not going to look like she belongs on the presidential stage. Now, the other thing that Oprah will have working against her is a very large body of programming in which, and please fact check me on this, could it be said that Oprah, based on the guests she's had and the products she's featured on her shows, would you say that Oprah is pro-science? Let's fact check me here. Those of you who have watched her show, yeah, she's promoted Dr. Oz, and Dr. Oz has promoted a number of things which some medical people believe does not qualify as science. So it seems to me, that she would have a big problem with her portfolio, which, if it's looked at in an entertainment frame, you say, she was an entertainer. So you put a low standard on, the science. But now you say, wait a minute, don't we have 20 years of evidence of Oprah being fooled by snake oil salesmen? Think about it. How many times has Oprah put somebody on her show that didn't pass the science filter? Probably a few times, and those would certainly be trotted out. So if you're trying to handicap whether Oprah would get elected, I think you have to look at her lack of toughness in terms of a brand. She's probably very tough, in her own business. I'm sure she's plenty tough enough in her personal life and everything else. But in terms of the brand she's created, it's not going to look like the tough brand, and that will be problematic. It's easier to be the tough candidate who sometimes saves a kitten from a tree than it is to be the one who's always kind, and then you suddenly have to be a badass. That's a tough transition to make. I would also suggest that anyone who thinks that because Trump was a celebrity and he also got elected president, the celebrity part certainly helped, right? There's no doubt about that. But then to imagine by analogy that Oprah is also famous and also has, great public speaking skills, and, she's got a pretty good talent stack, as I like to say, that to imagine that analogy tells you something. It's like, oh, Trump was an entertainer, she's an entertainer, that will be good. That is just bad analogy thinking. So I think Oprah would be insanely popular, but she would be problematic when she got to the final contest against a Republican who was more of a hard ass. I think people are going to pick the hard ass. Yeah. She's being already groomed. Well, here I'm going to give Oprah a compliment. I think if I were to speculate, and this is nothing but speculation, that Oprah is smart enough that she knows running for president would be a bad idea. But it's also probably true that so many people are asking her about it, and she probably thinks that the country is in such bad shape with its current leadership. That would be Oprah's view, I would guess. She's probably seriously considering it. But my guess is she's smart enough to know that that people want her for more emotional reasons and more reactive reasons to the president than they do because they think she would be the best president we've had. She would be very interesting, though. I can't imagine a more interesting election. Yeah. Yeah, it would be, somebody just said here, it would be an election between you're fired and everybody gets a car. That's like a perfect description of the Republicans versus the Democrats, at least in, the caricature version. Oprah and Trump getting along famously, they might. That's interesting. Trump would have a hard time going at her hard. Oh, that's another, you have to consider that. That would be another advantage. It'd be tough to go up against her and get really mean with Oprah, but I suppose he would do it if he runs. I'm still saying that there's a better chance he won't run than that he will. Now, we've never seen Oprah get asked the hard questions on TV. That's true. Yeah, somebody said Trump absolutely could be mean to her. You're right, he could. It would just be a tricky proposition. Let's talk about black unemployment. So, President Trump is claiming success in the sense that black unemployment has reached its best, meaning its lowest level in 17 years. Now, if you look at that out of context, it looks pretty good. If you look at it in context, you can see that black employment has been increasing steadily for 10 years or more. So if you look at it in context, it's probably just where it was going to be as long as things were going well. But the president is cleverly and wisely taking credit for it. Now, his critics are saying, there you go again with your lying and your whatever, because you're taking credit for something that was just going to happen anyway. To which I say, do you know what a leader even is? Like, do you know what the job of being a leader is? Do you even understand how that works? The job of a leader, to a large extent, it is not only doing things right, but then telling people that you're doing things right so that you have the power to do more things right. So a big part of the job of leader is to claim credit for things that, well, you didn't necessarily completely do on your own, right? Now, it is totally fair for the president to say, in my administration, we reached the best level of employment, because he could have broken that. You know, if, let's say, Paul Krugman had been correct, then maybe the stock market would have sunk and consumer confidence would have gone down and maybe people would have hired fewer people. So it is certainly legitimate that the president takes some credit for the low unemployment. But it is also true that it probably was going to happen under another president anyway. That said, it is absolutely the right thing to do for President Trump or any other leader to claim a little bit more credit than maybe logic would give them, because that's how you get more credibility. It's how you make people feel good. It's how you build up consumer confidence. It's how you make the country feel right. Because if you get the country feeling right, everything good happens after that. Right? Everything good happens because the country feels right. Take even how you feel about racism. Let's say if you're a African American person living in the United States and you see that the president that you suspect is a racist is claiming credit for improving black employment. How do you process that? Well, you might reject it at first and say, well, maybe it was going to happen anyway. But over time, if there are enough of those kinds of things cumulatively, you can start to feel that at least the sharp edge of racism is at least dulled a little bit, right? So these things do change the real world, so taking credit wherever he can take it, and even taking a little too much credit, is exactly the job of the president. And, it is, I would consider it a low level of awareness about how the world works if you think he should not be taking credit a little bit more than he's maybe due. What was his strategy to boost black jobs? Well, his strategy, among other things, was to lower immigration rates. The thinking is that the immigrants were taking jobs at the lower end, and there was a disproportionate number of jobs that could have gone to the black Americans on the lower end. So that's part of it. And the other part of it is just removing regulations, boosting consumer confidence so that the employment rate for everybody improved. And when that happens, you get a little bit of an extra bump at the bottom because they're the people suffering the most. Somebody saying this is the most sexist period ever. I would say the opposite. I'd have to think about that, but my first reaction is that this is not even close to the most sexist period. I don't know, I would feel like this is the least sexist period in our history. I don't know where that would come from. Men are being emasculated. That is true. Many will argue that that's a good thing, but it's certainly a true thing. I'm just looking at your comments now. Men are afraid to smile at kids. Well, I think I've said before that I've implemented the Pence rule in my own life. The Mike Pence rule that he never goes to a meeting where he'd be alone with a woman. And I used to do that all the time. Like if somebody said, let's go to lunch, I would just say, okay. It's just lunch. Why wouldn't I? I'd go to lunch with a guy. Why wouldn't I go to lunch with a woman? Why would I treat them differently? But in our current situation, when you consider both your own personal life and how that can be affected, as well as how you were seen by others, I realized the other day that I hadn't really thought about it, but I had sort of drifted into the Pence rule myself. So at this point, if a woman, it wouldn't matter who she was, if she was married or single, it wouldn't matter what the reason was. If she asked me to go to lunch with just me, I would decline. I'd probably have to find some excuse for it, but I would decline. Yeah, I saw that you credited the sexist thing to the Golden Globes. I just don't agree with the thought. How much of a tax break am I getting? I'm in California, so I'm expecting my taxes to go up, but I don't have a final answer on that yet. So one of the big problems if you're either a woman or if you're black in particular is that a lot of the opportunities in life come from people you know. So if the only people you know are unemployed or don't have CEO jobs, well then the pool of people who could accidentally or even intentionally influence you to a good result just aren't there. And it seems to me that someday somebody's going to build an app that simply allows somebody who's in, I shouldn't use this word, but I'm going to use it anyway. I'll use it about women so that it sounds less bad. The women are in sort of a female ghetto when it comes to business connections, because adult white males have most of the business connections, for historical reasons. So if you're a young woman and you would like to have the advantage of knowing people who are very successful and have done a lot of things, it's harder for you to cross over and interact with men, partly because of the Pence rule, partly because women hang out with women, men hang out with men. And the same if you're black. You mostly know other black people who may or may not have the same amount of connections as the average white person who, your neighbor might be a CEO of something, right? But a lot of people live in a neighborhood where their neighbor is definitely not the CEO of anything. So how do you fix that? And I keep thinking that there must be an app solution where you're just creating essentially mentors, maybe by Skype, maybe in some other way. I don't know exactly how to do it, but it's an enormous problem. Because when people talk about the white privilege, if I could put one variable on white privilege that's the biggest variable about white privilege and about being male in particular. So let me limit this to white male privilege, is that there are so many successful white males and people tend to hang around with people who are like them. I'm always meeting billionaires. My normal life, I run into billionaires. That's like a normal day for me would be, it would be completely normal in my life to have a conversation with somebody who has a net worth of over $100 million. Like, there would be nothing unusual about that day for me. And so I have access to insane amount of advice and resources and everything else should I want to take advantage of them. How could I be useful to either women or the black community who might want access to some of those connections, but they don't know me, right? They just haven't met me. Now let me give you, I'm going to change pace there. You get a similar effect by listening to me. So my book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, was meant as a partial fix for the fact that not everybody has good mentors and role models in their life. So I tried to take everything that I knew about creating systems for success and putting them in one place so that if you didn't have any role models, you could just get it from the book. You going to exploit us now? Probably. Now, the one thing that yeah, it's my book. The title is called How to Lose at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. Yeah, so people are saying, my sons have gotten jobs because of who we know. Most people get jobs based on who they know. So there was a segment on NPR the other day, and I didn't hear the segment, but I heard the teaser of it, and so they may have talked about what I'm going to talk about. But it seems to me that the biggest problem in the world, or let me make this even more general. I've speculated that we've moved into a reality where our biggest problems are information. In other words, we could solve almost all of our big problems through information. Now, that's not true if you've got a health problem that doesn't have a cure. But take unemployment. There is almost certainly a job available for every unemployed person. They just don't know where it is, and if it's somewhere that they don't live, they don't know how to get there or how to move their life there. So it seems to me that some kind of apps that teach people how to simply just move from where they are to where things would be better. What would be the best thing you could do for somebody who's poor and also lives in Detroit? This is an easy question. What is the best way to help somebody who is poor and also lives in Detroit? Help them leave, right? You can vote by leaving. So there should be some kind of process, some kind of app to get you out and get you to somewhere where the rent is cheap and you start a new life and get an apprenticeship and that sort of thing. Let's talk about the president's typo, in which instead of consequential, so he was quoting Mike Goodwin, who wrote a good article about his presidency being consequential. The president mistyped that in his tweet to say consensual. And of course people said, hey, is this intentional? Because, he's been blamed of sexual harassment, so he's saying consensual, to put that in your head. So hold on just a second. And I'm going to give you my ruling on this. All right, let me see your opinions first. Before I give you my ruling, was the typo in which he said consensual instead of consequential, was it intentional 4D chess, or was it just a typo? Yeah, I think most of you are on the same page I am. It was just autocorrect. I think there was nothing to that one. I saw over on Thomas Wicker, his Twitter feed, he was saying that some of you may have noticed that the entire Fire and Fury book was just released by WikiLeaks online. So you can see the entire book for free online. Now, I am not in favor of that because I am an author. And that has happened to me, having my entire book stolen and put online for free. And it's not a good feeling when you're an author. Now, Victor speculated that that the author and the publisher might have done that intentionally because the author had already made his money. He's speculating that the author did it, not the publisher, because the author had already made his advance. In other words, authors get paid in advance, so there was nothing to lose by putting it online. I can tell you that that is not the way the economics work for being an author. He would be right in the case of a normal book. Normally the advance is all the author gets. But in this special case of where a book looks to be a much bigger deal than the publisher could have ever imagined at the time they wrote the offer to the author, in that case, the advance almost certainly will be earned out. In other words, the book will sell so much that the publisher would owe a lot more money to the author eventually, and probably by the end of the year. So I think Thomas got an assumption wrong because this is a special case where the author's advance would be earned out fairly quickly. That doesn't usually happen. Do you get earned out? I have on some books and not on others. So my book How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, if it had a year ahead like it did this past year, I think it would earn out in about 18 months. So buy that book if you like. That's the one that helps me the most. Thoughts on Trump's stable genius tweet? Well, I've talked about that at some length. Do I know QAnon? I do not. I mean, not personally. Thanks. Yeah, a lot of people say my book changed their lives. I heard a lot about that. Toward the end of the year, a lot of people were assessing their year and wrote to me to say that my book changed their life or changed the life of their kids or their spouse or something. And I got to say, that's a good feeling. If you're an author, there's no better feeling than that somebody writes and says, your book completely changed my life. That's sort of why I do it. Thank you. Giving it to your young child is a good play. Why do you think dyslexia is your superpower? That sounds like something I said once. So I'm slightly dyslexic, meaning that I don't have often a sense of the order that things came into my mind, especially when I hear them. When I hear a phone number, for example, and somebody says, phone number is blah, 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 blah. I hear all the numbers, but I don't even have a good guess of the order that they came in if they say it too quickly. And I noticed when I was a bank teller that I transposed numbers like crazy. So I've speculated that there's a weird superpower to that because I don't see time as linear. In other words, I see the world as this big mass of probabilities, and I think that changes everything about how I view my what is possible, how I view whether my opinion is the one opinion. It just changes your entire sense of reality. You've had a lot of brain hiccups. That is true. Somebody just said, I'm the most influential person in your 18-year-old's life. Well, that's an 18-year-old who has a lot of potential. Because if you're paying, not just because they're paying attention to me, but an 18-year-old who's paying attention to the sorts of topics I talk about in terms of having a system versus a goal, that sort of thing, that really does bode well for for a young brain if you're already consuming that type of content. Dyslexia doesn't affect persuasion or susceptibility. What do I think of Michael Moore, hypocrite? You know, if anybody's noticed, and probably you never have you ever noticed that I tend not to call people hypocrites? You know, you've been watching me talking about politics for a long time, many of you. Have you noticed that I don't go the easy route and say, well, that person said this, but last year they did this? You know, the hypocrite. And the reason is that it's like the simplest level of analysis. Yeah, it's just boring. It might be true that somebody said, I'll do X, but then they did the same thing they said they wouldn't do. But I don't care. It's not influential. It doesn't change anybody's mind. Hypocrite is the weakest attack on an enemy you could ever come up with. There's no persuasion benefit to it whatsoever. What do you think of Penn and Teller saying hypnotism is bullshit? I've heard that they say that, and I don't know exactly the details there, so let me give you a general answer. Penn and Teller are some really smart people, and they're really good at looking through bullshit. So when those guys disagree with me, I'm going to do a full stop, and I'm going to really look at my assumptions, right? Now, I wouldn't say that about everybody. I would say that about, you know, maybe Nicholas Nassim Taleb. I would say that about a few people. But there are a few people who, if they disagree with you, instead of immediately figuring out why they must be wrong, I do a full stop and say, okay, maybe I'm wrong, because I don't expect this person to be disagreeing with me, and if that person disagrees with me, I'm gonna check my assumptions. But I believe, and I'm speculating here, that when I think Penn Jillette in particular, when he says that the hypnosis is bullshit, I think that means more about the claims of it, because there's a lot of overclaim. But there's no question that a person in a hypnotized state is relaxed. There's no question that when you tell somebody their arm is weightless and they feel it floating, that they're experiencing something that's outside their normal realm. And there's certainly evidence that for some people, using hypnosis to get a specific result gets them the result. Doesn't mean there was no other way to do it, but it can get you to a result. So I would agree with Penn and Teller that there's a layer of claims about hypnosis that are not true. You know, in other words, especially the NLP stuff, that's more BS than science. But the base practice of relaxing people and associating, let's say, a happy thought with something so that the happy thought bleeds onto the other thought, you know, there's a lot of it that just would be flat out normal advertising, marketing, cognitive scientists would agree, you know, really based on pretty solid stuff. But yes, there are some claims in hypnosis that are, can you hypnotize? Somebody said, can you hypnotize women in the bedroom? But it was written in all caps. Calm down. Calm down. Turn off your cap lock. I know you got pretty excited there that you could hypnotize women in the bedroom. But we won't be talking about that here. All right, I think I'm done for now. Why don't you go and have a great day? That's my suggestion for the day. I'm hypnotizing you. Have a great day. Bye.